Okay, so with data collection, what's really important is that as you're thinking about doing these programs and you're planning the next few years of these programs, that you have the ability to actually measure some impacts in those communities. And um, there's a lot of kind of standardized models on how you do impact analysis and how you do baseline and inline and endline surveys. Um, the best suggestion is, if you can get someone with an M&E background, monitoring and evaluation, to help with this, or a local university or school, college that has students that have some background in developing surveys and doing this kind of data analysis. It'll help a lot. Um, One of the reasons to do data analysis is not just for tracking impacts and being able to show if you're getting some social return on whatever the cost of implementation was, and we'll go into budgets later about what those typical costs are. Um, but you also want to be able to really see how things are going on a day-to-day basis, on a monthly basis, quarterly basis, and really sort of diagnose how the community is going. So first, I'm going to step you through a typical baseline, which will be available as part of the course that we use. We use Open Data Kit, which is a free open source um, data collection tool where it uses Android phones to um, collect data, including GPS points and pictures. And so it's a really nice way of just going into a community and being able to sort of just grab a bunch of data to sort of back up or augment your ideas on how the currency should be set up. So I'm just going to go through very briefly here a typical survey. So generally, again, we're not surveying a community until we're pretty sure that we're going to do a program there. Because quite often in communities, just the act of going around and doing a survey creates a lot of expectation. And so one big important piece is basically not give too much of an expectation. We tend to work with universities for this reason, so that there's a third party of people going in and helping with this research before we even go on and do implementation. So everything from starting out, what's their name, what are all their names, their phone number, various demographics like what village do you live at, getting a GPS point for that location, what levels of schooling do they have, how many household members are they living with and supporting, what age they are, gender they are, civil status, married, not married, the number of kids that they're supporting through school, what kind of land and assets that they own. And a lot of these demographic information is there. On one side, it's just to be able to say, okay, if we're doing something like a poverty index, we want to be able to say, okay, well, definitely that's going to, this person's income, you have to gauge it against how many people they're living with and, in what conditions they're living. And also, we want to later on be able to compare groups against each other. So it's one thing to just say, I'm going to go into a community before we do implementation and sample how everyone's doing financially and socially, and then I'm going to go back a year later and see, was there any change, right? Well, how would you know that that change is due to the program? It could just be due to just some economic changes or political changes. There could be a lot of ways that that could change. So generally you want to have control groups also. And so the idea with a control group is you want to have demographically similar people, right, in a community that's not going to be touched by the intervention or the currency at all to really compare against. So the idea of having control groups and then being able to basically pick and choose and in some ways match similar professions and genders and things like that against the groups to see, was there a significant change in this treatment community compared to this control community. And so the next few questions that we've got on our typical baseline survey is, what are your sources of income? What products do you sell? What's your main source of income out of all your sources of income? How many years have you been selling or producing whatever is the source of your income? How long have you been at it? How much is your total rent? Where do the majority of your customers live? what are good months of the year for your business, what are the bad months of the year for the business, and then what is the range in sales over those months? What's your typical sales revenue? What's your high and low sales revenue? And you have to be really careful because a lot of these questions are going to be extremely localized. You have to really ask these questions in not only the local language, but in a local way that really makes sense. Business revenue might not be the right term for them, but essentially you want to get the range on how much they're selling. You know, what is the volatility in the seasonality of that system in that community. So if you see that on average the net revenue of everyone you're sampling drops to 10% of what it was during peak seasons, that gives you some sense of excess capacity in that community. How volatile is that market? What is their ultimate capacity right now? What could it potentially be? And especially if they had some more stable medium of exchange. And again, we're really trying to get to the heart of what stops this community from continuously trading, and where does the majority of the money come from, and where is it circulating in the community, and where does it go back out, and how often is it going back out? Locality of customers, we're really trying to get at, are you an importer or exporter, or are you a local goods or service provider? So then the next part is expenditure. So what goods and services do you buy? Where do you buy them? What was your total expenditure in terms of school fees and everything from transport and food and clothing? Another thing I really recommend on these surveys is that for the most part, you really, really don't want your surveyors or the people you're surveying to have to ever really type anything in. If there's multiple choice with ranges for these things, it speeds things up a huge amount, and it tends to, I feel like people guess a little bit less. They feel more comfortable giving a range rather than giving an exact number. And the truth is, most of these things, if you're going to ask people what their monthly expenditure in the last month was, that could extremely vary, right? And so a lot of these questions, the best you can do is try to triangulate with different sources of information. Like if you can get business records from these groups, if you can do journaling with them in terms of really understanding their businesses, at least with maybe your small pilot group, it's really worth the time spent to really get to know exactly how things are flowing in that community. What's your expenditure on rent? Rent is usually a big part of expenditures, and what's your expenditure on food and healthcare? And then a few questions here around, how often do you give money to support people or groups without expecting compensation? So this is kind of like gifting. So how much gifting is in that community? And we put these questions in because there was this idea that maybe we'd be affecting gifting somehow, that people might be gifting less or more, and it'd be nice to be able to measure that. And so there's a few questions here around, do you give your time and services to people? Do you give money to people? Is that changing? Is that something we can maybe see change over this intervention with the local currency? And generally, we see a huge increase to gifting. And the theory for why that's true is that we are unlocking a lot of informal debt that goes on in the community. So if a woman owes the school teacher 200 shillings and that debt is sat on for a month, essentially it is illiquid debt, right? So if instead she can give that teacher an IOU in the form of a local currency, he can now trade that debt around to the rest of the community, right? So he could trade it back to someone who might need that woman's services where the teacher doesn't, for instance. And so the idea is that instead of people just being in debt to one another, they essentially are allowing each other to trade each other's debts and creating a credit based on that. So that really, like, what we're doing is we're liquidating the future potential capacity of that community as a credit and allowing that credit to circulate. And that credit is essentially, in a way, saying we're trading our debts amongst each other. And so it's nice to understand, is the freedom from debt, from these small debts, the freedom, of being able to trade that debt, does it unlock some more ability to give in the community? So that's a good question for an anthropologist to come study. Let's see what else. So means of payments, we want to also know how often are they buying on credit and how often are they buying on cash, and how often do they do barter. It's pretty rare to find that much barter going on, but it's interesting to look at the case where there already is some barter in those communities. Finally, we get to means of payment in terms of market. So where do you sell? Where's the closest market to you? How often you go to those markets? What's the second closest market? On a good market day, if people are selling at markets, how much are they earning at those markets? And how much are they earning on bad market days? What's the volatility in the local markets? Because that's something we want to help to increase. Then we ask about group membership. Are you a member of some? This survey I'm looking at right here was built in Congo, so they're talking about solidarity groups. In Kenya, it might be community-based organizations or self-help groups. But basically, are you a member of an identified group within that community, and how does it work? What is that group doing? What's the size of it? Is it producing food? If so, what are the products being produced on that land? What do you guys do as a group? Is it a savings group? How does that work? Because generally, we're looking at implementing through existing groups and communities. We're not looking at creating groups. And that's, when I first started these programs, I was doing a lot of group creation, and I consider a lot of that to have been a mistake to some degree. That sometimes when you go into a community, and it depends on who you are and what kind of intervention you have and how much of a foreigner you are and things like that, but creating groups and communities tends to be something that's used to sort of game donors, especially in Kenya. So in that group, what is the capacity of that group? What are the profits being made? How is the money being distributed out to members? And is there some excess capacity in that group that could be utilized to essentially back the currency, right? So we're really here trying to say, okay, what is it in that community that is going to be sort of the backer of last resort? Is there a cooperative business or a social enterprise or a business that you as an implementer can go and support perhaps with excess inventory, and that's sort of like the spark that lights the fire to keep the currency going. A lot of other questions we ask. One is food security. So do you have insufficient amounts of food to eat? How often does your household have a good meal? And that's going to be a local question. Is it meat and fish or whatever? Is your daily spending on food, what is it during a good season and bad season? How much does it change? For the most part, people are spending these currencies on food. I would say it's something like 75% of the spending that we have in these currencies is daily food. And we see increases of how much people are spending on food on a daily basis, and that's related to food security. So this is an important issue all across sub-Saharan Africa. Trust and solidarity. Is trust increasing in the village? Would you say that people in the village can be trusted? Would you say that most people that you do business with can be trusted? Can you say that the village people are willing to help if they need it? Will they ask for help? Will you help them? What are the biggest problems facing the village or the community? With these trust questions, we do tend to look at, even when piloting, we tend to go to existing groups or groups that have a little bit more trust relationships, because it means that they already have, it's a bit of a head start, in other words. So I give you the comparison, like working in informal settlements and slums, we're talking something on the order of a year to 2 years of implementation of things we've tried to do in those slums in terms of getting them independent and whatnot. And we've accelerated that over the years, and we're doing better now. But working in urban or rural areas that already have trust. If they're a bit more homogenous ethnically, for instance, or they've known each other for a longer amount of time, it's actually a lot easier to get them excited about working together, and it makes things a little bit accelerated. In some cases, very accelerated. One of the biggest problems that you might have in a community is starting with a group that isn't really a strong group and that people don't want to be part of it. And one warning factor is sometimes you don't want to really start with a group identity as the identity of the currency, because some people will say, "Oh, I'm not part of that group," and it really sort of limits the circulation. Problems facing the community, again, we're talking about health issues, corruption, education, and that list, I mean, you'll see it on the materials, but that's something to really colloquialize or to localize. Consultation of others. Do you have to consult other peoples when you make decisions? And so this is a generic kind of behavioral economics question, which gets into how people feel about how empowered they are really in terms of making decisions, and is the currency helping people feel freer in a sense around being able to make decisions about their lives. Financial status, like, do you consider yourself normal, rich, poor compared to the people around you? And this is an interesting question because it, depending on that answer, in average on communities, it really does change people's perception of themselves and poverty. And in rural areas, quite often you see people feel they're very normal and they might be making minuscule amounts of money compared to people living in slums. But people in slums say that they're extremely poor, even though they have relatively more money. And a lot of that's because they're living around a lot of people who are quite rich in the city. So we tend to take a photo of the business or person. And finally, the idea is that you are using a lot of people's time in these surveys, and generally, we recommend taking at least 20 minutes. If you can shorten the survey for your needs, that's better, but you're taking time out of people's work schedules and everything, and so we try to compensate if we can, if there's funding for that. Sometimes it's not necessary. Sometimes it's a commodity like a bar of soap or a kilo of flour or something like that. Make sure to thank them and understand that you will be back at some point to collect more information, and the usefulness of this information really determines if/how programs are going to roll out, and it helps people understand what are the issues and problems in the community. That's our yearly survey, and we tend to do that every year, starting before we even start the programs. And then there's a lot of other data that we take during the first kind of year of implementation, and it kind of varies throughout the time. And there's everything from our internal metrics on the quality of the data we're taking. So we have people going out and verifying that we're getting good quality data. Again, with a paper currency system, you don't have a lot of verifiable transaction data. All you have is people telling you what they've done. If you can insert logbooks or work with the cooperative or social enterprise in terms of really understanding and seeing that they're filling out books appropriately and keeping different columns for Kenyan shillings versus the local currency, that helps a lot to do verification. And a lot of times it's just asking people the same question or doing some, like verify, let's say 1% of your monthly data coming in. We look at the cost in the community compared to the impacts. We look at the financial reporting of the businesses that we're working with. We have essentially like a circulation counts and sort of a vault. So if you've printed a certain amount of currency, you really want to keep track of how much you've issued, of course. And the goal is really to issue as much as you can into the community so that there isn't a vault sitting around with excess currency, because it's expensive to keep those types of things, and it's just a risk that it's better not to take. We do a lot of capacity building and training with our team, and look at partnerships is another thing that these are all sort of indicators that we look at on a monthly, to quarterly basis, and partnerships in terms of government partnerships, NGOs, schools in the area, churches or mosques. And then looking at the network itself, we continue to follow cash flow, the legality of the group, making sure that they're registered however they need to be registered with the government. We look at how much they're contributing towards community activities, our space and hours being contributed for the community service kind of aspects of the program. We look at local government and leaders, how they're taking part in the programs and how often are we communicating with them. We do a lot of work to make sure that we send them regular letters and reports of how things are going, so there's no surprises to them. They understand the impacts of the program, and we're really trying to push into allowing the government to allow a certain amount of tax in these programs, or at least support or even top up like the local chief's salary or the constituency development funds or some of the operating costs of local government. Marketing and advertising, we tend to produce stickers that go on buildings or on, like, if a woman's selling vegetables, on like the tubs that she's using. And so we produce a lot of that material and want to make sure that it's actually being used and people know where to find things. We produce documentaries, or we do documentaries. We also do directories. And then we try to collect as much feedback as we can from the community on any activity that we're doing, and the trainings that we're doing in the community, how much monitoring and evaluation we're doing in general. For the businesses themselves, like the social enterprises that we're working with, we do financial audits with them. We do kind of systematic audits of their operating capacity. And we look at how much they're using of the community currency. And if you imagine there's a certain amount pumped in at the beginning based on their excess capacity, that all went out into the community as sort of an airdrop as a mutual credit to the community, and then eventually that level drops back down because everyone will eventually spend it at, let's say, that cooperative, those some initial cooperative businesses. Then it gets reissued through operating expenses and community service events and more member credit. So there's this level going in, it drops down, and then the level pops up again in terms of how much is in circulation. And that's something we're really trying to monitor quite a lot, because it gives us a gauge on how much more we could add to the community, or if there's too much in the community. Market volatility, again, is something we continuously try to measure. Local trade volume, trust and solidarity, education, like how specifically, how much is going into the local school system, how much is going into, let's say, tree planting or existing partnerships. Are the group members able to save more Kenyan shillings? How is their Kenyan shilling balance changing? Is the local currency replacing Kenyan shillings, or is it actually increasing their Kenyan shillings? And we've actually found that the latter to be true in all the communities we've worked with. But it's an important thing to really think about in a way, is, are you taking over Kenyan shilling sales, or are you increasing the capacity of the community to trade more, and that trade is denominated in the local currency, and as a result perhaps they're able to save and even make more sales in Kenyan shillings. Poverty indexes is something we look at. Food security we've mentioned before. That's pretty much it. So some of those are yearly basis, and then we have monthly monitoring we do too. We try to call or visit almost every single member within, it depends on the size of the network, but something within like a 3-month basis. So it really depends on how big your team is and how able they are to do that. And a lot of that monitoring is less about monitoring, and it's more about just checking in and making sure that they understand how the program's working, and if, let's say, there was, the initial airdrop gave them 400 Kenyan shillings worth of the vouchers of the community currency, and now they have 600, so they're 200 above where they left off, or where they started. And we kind of give them the idea, like, okay, it's time, you need to be spending it more. What are the things you need in the network? Can we connect you with other people? And so there's a lot of like kind of hand-holding and brokering, especially within the first, kind of exponentially less as the year goes on, but as soon as you do those initial pilots and launches, like, people really need to immediately get that spark of where to be spending these currencies. And so the signage, leading people by the hand and saying, oh, you need water, or you need soap, or whatever it is, and saying, okay, well, here's someone in the network that has it. So brokering those trades, working with agents or brokers in the community to benefit from the community fund, and making that a role is also very important too. To think long term in these communities. It may not be us or you there for the next 10 years, so who's going to be maintaining these systems? How much do they really need to be maintained? Ideally as little as possible, but having someone who's acting as sort of an information or directory store is really important. And some of those roles can be augmented digitally through online marketplaces and whatnot. So that's sort of a rough overview of our monitoring evaluation and our baseline studies, and what are some of the things that we're looking at that we think are important in measuring the impacts of these programs. So thanks.